All right, so we are going to look at graphing quadratic functions. So in chapter 8, towards the end, we were learning how to factor quadratic trinomials. Well, now we're going to start learning how to analyze these quadratic trinomials, and we're going to learn how to graph them. What I mean by graph them is we are going to be able to take those equations, that x squared plus bx plus c, and we're going to be able to create it as a graph. Um, and these graphs aren't going to be linear. They're not going to be a line, a straight line, like we did with linear equations, right? They might be similar to exponential functions, how they have a curve, but these quadratics are going to have their own special shape. And quadratics, they are in the shape of what's called a parabola. Okay? And this is what a parabola looks like. It looks like a U or an upside down U. Okay? And so a quadratic function is a nonlinear graph and written in the form f of x equals ax squared plus bx plus c. There's that quadratic trinomial, the ax squared plus bx plus c. And if you remember, f of x is interchangeable with y. So you could also write this as, let me get my ink here. You could also write this as y. Maybe. Nope, we're not going to write it as y. So we could also write this as y equals, they're looking for me? X squared, ax squared plus bx plus c. So let me just see what's going on here. So here it is, as you can see, that y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. So again, those are interchangeable. So what we are going to be doing today is we are going to be looking at, or we're going to be working with, how can we graph these? But before we graph them, we're going to learn about traits that we can pull from this. And these traits will help us when we are graphing. So the first thing we are going to look at is the function f of x equals ax squared plus bx plus c. And the two things we are going to look at is the axis of symmetry, which in short we call the AOS. And the axis of symmetry is x equals, that's very important, x equals the opposite of b all over 2a. You're going to want to write down this formula because you're going to need to make sure this is entrenched in your brain. Right? So the first thing we always find is the axis of symmetry. And we use the formula x equals opposite of b or negative b all over 2a. The other information we can get from this is we can pull the y-intercept. And if you remember, the y-intercept is where the graph crosses the y-axis. And the y-intercept is pulled from the c value. So in the y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, your y-intercept is the c. So if you remember, y-intercepts are always 0, so it'd be 0, comma c. And we'll do an example like this so that you'll see it. The other thing we can determine whether the parabola is going to open up, or we can determine if the parabola is going to open down. And how we do that is we look at the A. If your A is positive, the graph will open up. If your A is negative, your graph will open down. All right, next. So that again here. So again, if A is greater than 0, or if your A is a positive value, the graph will open up. If your A is less than 0, it'll open downward. Or basically meaning is if your A is negative, it will open down. The other things to identify, because we're going to talk about these, is if your graph opens up, it has a lowest point. This lowest point is called your minimum. And if your graph opens down, it has a maximum point or a highest point, and that's called your maximum. And we're going to learn how to identify those as well. So these are all the things that we are going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at the AOS. We are going to be looking at the y-intercept. We are going to be looking at the maximum or minimum value for your graph. And then the fourth thing we're going to look at is identifying the vertex. And your vertex is this highest point right here, or your lowest point right here. Your vertex is basically where the graph changes directions, right? Where your graph changes direction from there. So again, we have our AOS, we have our y-intercept, we have our max or min value, and we have our vertex. So we are going to find all of these. We are going to find our axis of symmetry, or AOS. We are going to find our vertex. We are going to find our y-intercept, and we are going to find the max/min value. So if I'm given the equation y equals 3x squared plus 6x minus 4, and I want to find my AOS, that's always the first thing you find. When given an equation in standard form, you're always going to find your AOS first. And if you remember, the formula for the AOS is x equals negative b over 2a. I always like to write my formula first. This way, again, I know it's helping me memorize. So now I'm going to substitute in my values. So what is my b value? My b value is 6. Well, I want it to be negative. All over 2 times, what's my a value? My a value is 3. Sometimes it helps if you go a, b, c. Sometimes that helps out. Now we just do the math. We have 2 times 3 on the bottom, so we have negative 6 over 6. And then we take negative 6 and we divide it by 6. Negative 6 divided by 6 is a negative 1. So our AOS is x equals negative 1. That's our first thing we always find. We find our AOS by using our formula. The next thing we're going to find is our vertex. To find the vertex, we already have the x value of that vertex. Now we need to find the y value of the vertex. And to find the y value, you must plug your AOS back into your equation. So it's going to look like this. Y equals 3. In place of x, we're going to put negative 1. Plus 6. In place of x, we're going to put negative 1. Minus 4. Do the math. Negative 1 squared is 1. So we have 3 times 1. 6 times negative 1 is negative 6. Minus 4. 3 times 1 is 3. 3 minus 6 is negative 3. Negative 3 minus 4 is negative 7. So our vertex is at the point negative 1, negative 7. Our vertex is at the point negative 1, negative 7. So again, you find your AOS by using our formula. X equals negative b all over 2a. You find your vertex by plugging in your AOS back into your equation. That gives you the y value of your vertex. Next thing we're going to find is we are going to find, I'm going to see if I can change colors here. We're going to find our y-intercept. Remember, if you remember from earlier, our y-intercept is the c value. And if you look, our c value is negative 4. So our y-intercept is 0, negative 4. Y-intercept is 0, negative 4. And the last thing we need to find is the maximum or minimum value. Max/min. Well, if we look, A is positive. Since A is positive, it's going to open upwards. Since it's going to go open upwards, we're going to have a minimum value. And how we figure out the minimum value, it's the y value of your vertex. So your minimum is -7. Okay. So your minimum is -7. This is how you find all the parts of this. This will make sense once we start graphing the next day. But right now we're looking and we're finding all the different parts of the graph. First thing we find is our AOS. Next thing we find is our vertex. Then we identify our y-intercept, and then we identify our max or minimum value. Let's do another one. All right, and this time I'm going to write out here real quick. I'm going to write AOS because this is how you'll have it set up on your practice. I'm going to write out my vertex right here. I'm going to write my y-intercept right here. And then I'm going to write my max/min value. We'll write that right there. Okay. So this is how it will be on your practice. I'll give you an equation like that. I'll give you a list like that: AOS, vertex, y-intercept, max, min. And I like to list them in this order because that's a reminder. This is how we should always find them. So remember, first thing we find is our AOS. So to find our AOS, x equals -b. So -2 all over 2 times a, which is 1. Now we do our math. Negative and negative is a positive. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So our AOS, x equals 1. Next, we are going to find the vertex. So to find the vertex, we have the x value of the vertex. We need the y value. To do that, I am going to plug 1 back into x. Y equals 1 squared minus 2 times 1 minus 6. Let's do the math. 1 squared is 1. 2 times 1 is 2. Boom. 1 minus 2 is -1. -1 minus 6 is -7. Hey, happen to be the same one. So now our vertex is 1, because that's the x value of our AOS, comma, -7. Next, we are going to find our y-intercept. If you remember, the y-intercept is the c value. And here our c value is -6. So our y-intercept is 0, comma, -6. And then the last thing we need to find is our maximum or minimum value. Here our a is positive. Since a is positive, it will open up. So it will have a minimum value. And that minimum value is always the y value of the vertex. It will have a minimum value of -7. So remember, with these, we find our AOS. To find your AOS, x equals opposite of b all over 2a. To find your vertex, you plug in your AOS into the equation. To find the y value, so your vertex is the x value from your AOS, and then the y value of your vertex. Your y-intercept is always 0, comma, c. And then your max or min value is always the y value of your vertex. It is a minimum if a is bigger than 0. It's a maximum if a is less than 0. All right, this is one I want you to try on your own. So I want you to pause the video so that you can try this on your own to see if you are able to do this. All right. So hopefully you were able to get your AOS, x equals -3, your vertex, -3, -8, your y-intercept is 0, 10, and your minimum value is -8. Again, this is one for you to try on your own to see if you're able to get it. Next, so you should be able to find things when given an equation, but you also should be able to find these things when given a graph. So if I'm given the following graph here, so this is a parabola, this is a quadratic trinomial. I'm not asking you to create the equation of this. What I'm asking you to do is find the vertex, the axis of symmetry, the y-intercept, and the max or min value. The reason I left them this way is when given a graph, this is how I like to find it. So when given a graph, my vertex is the point where the graph changes direction. So the vertex is the point of the graph. So this point down here that I just circled is your vertex. So what is the ordered pair of that point? Well, the ordered pair is 1, -4. The vertex is 1, -4 because that's where this graph changes direction. Now, the next parts are kind of making connections with this stuff. So the axis of symmetry. When we're given an equation, the first thing we find is the axis of symmetry. And that says x equals. And that x value, or your axis of symmetry, is the x value of your vertex. So for here, my axis of symmetry is x equals 1. And the reason I know that is my axis of symmetry is the x value of my vertex. The next thing I can find is my y-intercept. Well, your y-intercept is where the graph crosses the y-axis. So right here is my y-intercept, because that is where the graph crosses the y-axis. So that point is 0, -3. And again, the last thing we need to identify is our max or minimum value. And our max or minimum value, okay, from looking at this visualization, it does have a minimum because that's the furthest down point. And if you remember, the minimum is the y value of your vertex. So our minimum is -4. So again, this is finding all the points when given a graph. Your vertex is where the graph changes direction. Your axis of symmetry is the x value of your vertex. The y-intercept is where the graph crosses the y-axis. And your max or min value is the y value of your vertex. All right, let's do another one together. First thing we want to find is our vertex. So our vertex, again, is where the graph changes direction. It's the point. So this has a vertex of -1, 4. Because that's where that point is. Your axis of symmetry is the x value of your vertex. Your y-intercept is where the graph crosses the y-axis. So our y-intercept is 0, 3. And your max or min value is the y value of your vertex. But because this graph points down, it is going to have a maximum. You can also tell because your a is negative. And so our maximum value here is now 4. So again, this is being able to identify all the stuff from a graph. All right. So that is the lesson for today. You're able to identify your axis of symmetry, your vertex, your y-intercept, and your maximum minimum value. Remember, your axis of symmetry is x equals the opposite of b all over 2a.